The Book of Judges is Genesis gone wrong. If you have hypothetical questions about the worst case scenarios in Genesis, you can usually find the answers in Judges. What if Abraham sacrificed Isaac? What if Lot gave his daughters to the men of Sodom? So how did these books end up this way? It may not be the way you think. This is not a religious channel, but it's not a religious channel. An observation you can make in a straightforward reading of the Heptateuch, that is the Pentateuch, or the Torah, plus Joshua and Judges, is that you see a repeating but diminishing cycle of miracles. A well-known example of this is Moses epically parting the Red Sea in Exodus, which is later recycled when the Israelites crossed the less impressive Jordan River in Joshua. Some of these cycles, like crossing Jordan, do even repeat into Samuel, but that's a topic for another day. If you look closely, some of these cycles repeat to the point that they don't even have any lingering supernatural elements, making them harder to see if you don't know what to look for. It's almost like the Heptateuch kicks off with blockbuster movies but doesn't have enough budget remaining for any more special effects in the later sequels. But I'm going to suggest that we should actually look at these in reverse order, as examples of progressive myth development. In this way, we start with the story that's closer to reality and end with a more fantastic retelling. Why start at the end? The Heptateuch has a clear chiastic structure. A chiasm or chiasmus has a repetition of parallel concepts in reverse order, like A, B, C, D, C, B, A. The episodes in Judges correspond to those in Genesis, just like Joshua corresponds to Moses in the Exodus, Leviticus corresponds to the second law, Deuteronomy, with numbers in the center. A long-form chiasmus can be made just by arranging the books in order, but individual narratives like those in Genesis and Judges would probably need to be redacted concurrently. I think Genesis is newer material that's written to sound older, and Judges is older material that's placed at the end of the story. The Samaritan Pentateuch is proof that you can have the Torah without Joshua and Judges, but Joshua or Judges don't really exist without this structure. Joshua or Judges could have originally been standalone books that completed the chiasmus. For instance, the Song of Deborah in Judges 5, which may be one of the oldest parts of the Hebrew Bible, mentions Sisera's men being swept away in a river similar to Pharaoh's army in the Red Sea, even though that doesn't actually happen in the Deborah story. It may have been decided later that two separate books were needed for a one-to-one correspondence. To make this case, I'm going to start at the most unlikely of places, the last 5 chapters of Judges. For most people, these are not familiar passages, so you may want to read it in its entirety before continuing this video. These stories don't get taught in Sunday school, for obvious reasons. They contain some horrific incidents, usually without clear moral guidance or lessons. However, I'm going to argue that these obscure passages actually sow the seed that germinates into the Torah that reads before it. The repetitive theme of this passage is, in those days Israel had no king, and everyone did as they saw fit. So the text itself presents it as a line of demarcation between pre- and post-monarchical Israel. These episodes are positioned after the story of Samson, which is heavy with parallels to Hercules in Greek mythology. In contrast to Samson's labors, Judges 17 to 21 are devoid of miracles or really any divine presence other than a misleading oracle. This is especially apparent if you compare the theophany of Genesis 19 with its parallel in Judges 19. In Judges, you have this disturbing story in which a Levite traveling with a male servant and a concubine are shown hospitality by an old man. But while staying there, the men of the city surround the house and demand to sexually violate the visitor. Instead, he sends out his concubine, who the men horrifically rape to death all night. The next day, he finds his concubine dead outside the door, takes her body home, cuts it up into 12 pieces, and sends the dismembered body to all parts of Israel. Working our way backwards, the next story we'll jump to in this cycle is often overlooked as a parallel hospitality narrative. It's the story of Rahab and the 2 spies in Joshua 2, which is one you may have actually heard in Sunday school. In this well-known story, Rahab hides 2 Hebrew spies in her home before the conquest of Jericho. On a side note, I made a previous video of how the Joshua narrative seems to be out of order. There's no reason given why Joshua sends spies again other than he seems to have to repeat everything Moses did. But instead of another 12, he only sends 2 this time, which corresponds to the 2 good spies which gave a good report in Numbers 13. I'm not trying to rearrange the text to support a point, because it doesn't really affect my theory either way. However, there is another inconsistency in this text which does. After the fall of Jericho, Rahab's story ends with an ideological statement in Joshua 6:25, which says, "She lives among the Israelites to this day." This is kind of an odd thing to say about a person. Even if we are to believe an individual was still living at the time of writing, it's not really meaningful after their death. Etiological statements with this formula are frequent in the Heptateuch, but usually they're in reference to something semi-permanent, such as a place name, a rock formation, or a people group. This whole was apparent in the Jewish tradition, with one legend suggesting Rahab never died. I suspect that we may be missing a metamorphosis here. This seems to match the formula of metamorphosis and etiology that we see in Ovid's Metamorphoses. For more on that, I made a previous video about the story of Baucis and Philemon. That story is lesser known to Sunday school students, which is unfortunate because you really can't fully appreciate the story of Lot and Sodom without it. If you don't already know that story, like the two gods in the Metamorphoses, two angels come to Sodom and Lot takes them in. The men of Sodom want to violate the two visitors, just like the Levite and his concubine. The angels lead Lot and his family away from the city before its destruction, but Lot's wife looks back and is turned into a pillar of salt. Lot sees the smoke rising from the destroyed city, just like we'll see elsewhere. I previously argued that the survivalist epilogue with Lot and his daughters is an insertion from the War of the Giants. I think the story flows without it because the presence of salt is a mythologization of Abimelech salting the earth after destroying a city in Judges 9, and the next story after Sodom coincidentally involves a different Abimelech. The pillar of salt is more implicit, but it has nevertheless been interpreted as an etiology. Josephus mentions seeing this rock formation, which remains to this day. Next, I'm going to focus on the tribal warfare that consumes the Israelites after the horror of the Levite and his concubine, and how the near extinction of the tribe of Benjamin dovetails into the mythical destruction of the Canaanites. So stay tuned.